In the spring of 1903, the city of Turin found itself at the center of a mystery that has never been fully explained. At the time, Turin was a city in transition. Wealthy industrialists commissioned grand architecture. Opera houses competed for prestige, and the city's cafes brimmed with intellectual debates about art, science, and the supernatural. Into this atmosphere stepped Giuliano Marchetti, a playwright whose name was scarcely known outside a few bohemian circles. His work, La Notte Senza Fine, or The Endless Night, was staged at a modest theater near the city's riverfront. By all accounts, the play should have been one of many avant-garde experiments that appeared and disappeared without fanfare. Yet from its very first performance, it seized the imagination and the sanity of those who witnessed it. Reports from opening night described something beyond ordinary theater. Audiences claimed the actors' voices did not end with their words but lingered, repeating unnaturally across the walls and rafters as though the theater itself had learned the lines. Women fainted during the second act, soldiers fled into the streets mid-performance, and a priest who attended later described the atmosphere as a ritual disguised as art. Though critics dismissed such accounts as hysteria, the strangeness of the play could not be denied. Unlike most productions which lasted 2 or 3 hours, Marchetti's script seemed to stretch endlessly. Some attendees swore they had been inside for entire nights, though the theater clock marked only a few hours. Others left unable to recall how the play had ended, as if their memory had been tampered with. By the second week, tickets to The Endless Night were selling for absurd sums, with aristocrats and intellectuals eager to test their courage. Doctors, however, began recording unusual symptoms among those who had attended. Several patients claimed they still heard fragments of dialogue in their sleep. Others reported shadows moving across their bedroom walls, speaking in voices identical to the actors. When priests began warning that the performance bordered on demonic invocation, the rumors only intensified. Marchetti himself fueled speculation by refusing interviews, appearing only briefly before performances and then vanishing backstage. The production was abruptly banned after just 3 weeks, though no official explanation was ever given. Some whispered that several high-profile citizens had gone mad after attending. Others claimed the ban came at the direct order of the Vatican, which feared the play's influence. Most chilling of all, the script itself seemed to disappear. No copy of La Notte Senza Fine has surfaced in archives, libraries, or private collections. Marchetti, too, vanished, leaving behind no confirmed record of his later life. Was he silenced, or did he deliberately erase himself along with his creation? Tonight, more than a century later, the legend endures. Was The Endless Night merely an exaggerated scandal of decadent high society? Or did the play itself awaken something that audiences were never meant to witness? This is the story of the forbidden performance that blurred the boundary between theater and ritual, art and possession. A play remembered not for its brilliance, but for the madness it left behind. Giuliano Marchetti's story begins in the heart of Turin, during the final decades of the 19th century, when Italy was still young as a unified nation and struggling to define its cultural identity. Born into a respectable middle-class family in 1875, Giuliano was raised in a home that valued refinement, education, and appearances. His father was a lawyer of some standing, stern but not unkind, while his mother hosted afternoon salons where conversation ranged from politics to the latest operas imported from Milan. From an early age, Giuliano seemed unlike other children. While his peers devoted themselves to sports or trades, Giuliano was drawn to books, particularly those that carried an air of mystery. He devoured Greek tragedies, Shakespeare's darker works, and the philosophical writings of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, whom he discovered as a teenager. To his parents, this precociousness was charming, proof of intellect. To his teachers, it was unsettling, for Giuliano often asked not how a character felt, but what hidden forces compelled them beyond their will. By the time he entered university, Giuliano had embraced the theater as both vocation and obsession. He studied philosophy formally, but he attended every play staged in Turin with the reverence others reserved for Mass. His early attempts at writing were modest morality plays in the classical tradition, drawing small but polite audiences. Titles such as The Honest Merchant and Virtue in Chains earned him recognition among the city's critics as a promising young writer, if not yet a genius. Behind these respectable beginnings, however, Giuliano nurtured ambitions that unsettled even his closest friends. His journals, preserved in fragments by a cousin decades later, reveal a mind increasingly fascinated not with theater as entertainment, but as transformation. The stage, he wrote in one entry, is not a mirror of life but a furnace. It must melt the soul and reforge it. The play must not end with applause but with silence, silence heavy as the grave. Such declarations hinted at a vision beyond convention, one that sought to use art as ritual. Turin at this time was fertile ground for such experiments. Known as one of the magic triangles of Europe, the city attracted both scientists and mystics. Spiritualist gatherings flourished in candlelit parlors, where mediums claimed to summon voices of the dead, and intellectuals debated the possibility of life beyond the material world. Giuliano, always restless, began attending these salons. To some, he was simply a curious playwright collecting material. To others, he was a true believer, eager to pierce the veil between stage and spirit. Witnesses later claimed he did more than observe. He participated, chanting phrases in archaic Italian, scribbling notes furiously as if harvesting the seance for dramatic inspiration. Rumors spread that he acquired obscure manuscripts from booksellers, some of which dealt with Greek mystery rites, Eleusinian ceremonies, and the supposed survival of Dionysian rituals into the modern age. Outwardly, Giuliano's reputation only grew. He was handsome, eloquent, and welcome at gatherings of Turin's elite. His wit charmed patrons, and his plays, though increasingly experimental, were staged at reputable theaters. Yet behind closed doors, his life grew more erratic. Friends described nights when he would disappear from parties abruptly, retreating to his study where he wrote until dawn. Servants reported hearing him muttering in voices not his own, pacing as though in dialogue with unseen companions. One confidant recalled Giuliano insisting that certain passages of his plays were dictated to him by voices older than Rome. When pressed, he laughed it off, but his eyes gleamed with a seriousness that made the remark difficult to dismiss. This duality defined Marchetti, the charming playwright who could delight patrons at dinner, and the haunted writer who filled his journals with fragments of dialogue that seemed torn from dreams or nightmares. His correspondence from the late 1890s reveals increasing frustration with conventional art. To a fellow dramatist he wrote, "The bourgeois want laughter, the critics want wit, the church wants morality, but none of them want truth. I tell you, the truth is terrible. It rends the mind. To write it, one must bleed." Such remarks alarmed his friends, who urged him to moderate his rhetoric lest he alienate potential supporters. Yet Giuliano seemed increasingly indifferent to success measured in tickets or reviews. What mattered, he claimed, was crafting a performance that could shatter the veil of the ordinary. The seeds of La Notte Senza Fine, the endless night, emerged during this period. Scholars believe he began sketching scenes as early as 1898, though the full manuscript has never been recovered. In letters, he hinted at a project unlike anything he had attempted before. "It will not be play but passage, not story but summoning." These cryptic phrases suggest an intention to merge theater with ritual, to create an experience that dissolved the boundaries between audience and performance. Those familiar with Turin's occult undercurrents argue that Giuliano may have drawn directly on the rites of mystery cults, which promised initiates visions of the divine through secrecy, music, and ordeal. By 1900, signs of obsession were unmistakable. Giuliano grew pale, withdrawn, his writing feverish. Visitors to his study described manuscripts strewn across the floor, pages filled with symbols and half-legible dialogue. He spoke of dreams in which shadowed figures dictated scenes to him, voices whispering lines that he transcribed upon waking. Some suspected opium or absinthe, substances common among artists of the era, but others insisted his conviction was too fierce to be mere intoxication. Whatever the cause, Giuliano worked tirelessly as if racing against time. Yet in public he remained a figure of fascination. Elite patrons still invited him to soirées, where he dazzled with talk of art's power to alter consciousness. One hostess recalled him comparing theater to the Catholic Mass. Both require ritual, both rely on repetition, both demand belief. But where the Mass worships a god, the play must worship humanity's abyss. Such statements, half blasphemy, half philosophy, provoked both scandal and admiration. The church kept its distance, but the avant-garde embraced him as a visionary. It was during these years that Giuliano's friendships began to fray. Several colleagues withdrew, claiming he was consumed by forces beyond his control. A painter who collaborated with him briefly remembered Giuliano's insistence that each scene of his new work correspond to a phase of initiation, that the lighting itself mimic the stages of death and rebirth. When the painter suggested moderation, Giuliano dismissed him, declaring that compromise was cowardice. "If they leave my play unchanged," he insisted, "they will not leave unchanged themselves." The deeper Giuliano descended into his project, the more accounts of his strange behavior multiplied. Servants whispered of nights when he stood at the window, arms outstretched reciting verses in languages none recognized. Guests found chalk circles drawn on the floor of his study, symbols etched like diagrams of forgotten rites. His family, once proud of his talents, grew uneasy. His mother begged him to abandon this obsession with shadows, while his father threatened to cut off financial support unless he returned to respectable subjects. Giuliano, however, could not be dissuaded. To him, the play had ceased to be a work of art. It had become destiny. The contradiction between his public charm and private mania fascinated Turin's gossip columns. Some hailed him as a genius too daring for his time. Others whispered he had lost his mind. In truth, both were correct. For Giuliano Marchetti embodied a paradox. The respectable son of a professional family, embraced by salons and critics, yet also the haunted seeker who scrawled dialogues dictated by unseen voices. In him, the innocence of a rising playwright collided with suspicions of forbidden inspiration. By 1902, whispers of his project circulated widely. Few knew details, but all sensed something momentous. Patrons whispered of a script that could not be read without unease, of rehearsals where actors left trembling, and of Giuliano himself proclaiming that this play would not simply be performed, but experienced as ordeal. Some dismissed such rumors as theatrics, but others feared he had crossed a threshold that art was never meant to breach. Thus, when La Notte Senza Fine finally opened in the spring of 1903, Turin was both curious and afraid. The origins of the play lay not merely in Giuliano's talent, but in his relentless quest to merge art with ritual, to channel voices beyond his own. What began as the innocent ambition of a young dramatist had transformed into something far stranger, a performance that seemed less written than conjured. From his ambitions we move to the play's first performances and their chilling consequences. When La Notte Senza Fine finally opened its doors to Turin's public in the spring of 1903, the audience filed into the dimly lit theater expecting another melodrama, another evening of fashionable entertainment, something to chatter about over brandy at midnight cafes. Yet from the very beginning, there was a strangeness about the performance that no one could quite name. The curtain rose, and instead of the familiar opening overture, there was silence. Dense, uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the slow shuffle of the actors emerging from shadow. Some spectators later claimed that in those first moments the air itself felt different, thicker, as though the stage exhaled a breath the audience was now forced to inhale. The actors spoke their lines in a cadence that did not resemble ordinary Italian, even though the words were technically comprehensible. Their voices lingered in the rafters long after they had stopped speaking, echoing unnaturally as though the theater itself had learned the script and was reciting along. At first, patrons laughed nervously, assuming this was some trick of acoustics. But when one actress stumbled mid-sentence, clutching her head and shrieking that someone was whispering into her ear, the laughter turned into an uneasy hush. She collapsed upon the boards, trembling, yet Giuliano Marchetti himself strode from the wings, assured the audience this was all part of the experience, and commanded the show to continue. That night the audience left in a daze. Some were exhilarated, boasting they had witnessed art of a higher order. Others were pale and silent, clutching their coats as if chilled to the bone. Within hours, rumors began spreading across Turin that something more than theater had transpired. Several attendees complained of vivid nightmares that same night, dreams in which they relived the play again and again, but with a terrible twist. They could not alter a single word, a single gesture, as if trapped inside the performance itself. A young schoolteacher confessed to her sister that she had awakened to find herself still reciting the lines of her character, though she had only been a spectator. A banker of considerable wealth who had attended with his wife reportedly woke screaming each night in the days that followed, clutching his chest, gasping that the play would not release him. Doctors diagnosed him with apoplexy, but his wife told friends that each night he raved about figures at the foot of his bed, actors who bowed endlessly without faces, until finally his heart gave out before dawn. Backstage, the servants and stagehands began to whisper their own stories. They claimed that props refused to remain where they were placed. A chair that had been moved into a corner reappeared center stage minutes later, though no one had touched it. A crucifix borrowed from a nearby church to decorate the set was found turned upside down during intermission, and though everyone denied responsibility, no one dared to touch it again. Costumes were reported missing and then discovered laid out neatly in different rooms as though someone, or something, was preparing for a role. Even mirrors in the dressing rooms were said to misbehave. Actors reported that their reflections lagged a moment behind their movements, and once an understudy screamed when her reflection smiled though she had not. These stories filtered beyond the theater, whispered first in the taverns, then in the broadsheets, and finally in the salons of Turin's high society, where people debated whether they were witnessing a revolution in art or the birth of madness. Yet it was not only the actors and patrons who suffered. The theater itself seemed altered. Attendants swore that applause sometimes erupted when the audience was utterly still. One usher remembered hearing a roar of clapping from the balcony, rushing upstairs only to find the seats empty, the dust undisturbed. At least 2 workers resigned after claiming to hear voices whispering in the rafters during rehearsals. Giuliano dismissed all of this as hysteria, insisting that art always unsettled the timid, but others were not so certain. Priests began to murmur warnings during sermons, suggesting that the play was not a performance at all, but an invitation to darker forces. Physicians spoke of contagion of nerves, claiming that the audience was swept into collective suggestion, but such explanations faltered when reports came of people collapsing days later, far from the theater, their final words repeating lines from the play. As the weeks unfolded, the list of incidents grew longer. A young couple who had attended opening night drowned themselves in the Po River, leaving behind a letter filled with phrases lifted directly from the script, written as though compelled by another hand. An actor developed a violent cough, insisting he felt as though ash filled his lungs. He died within a month, though no trace of illness was found in his body. A seamstress who worked on the costumes claimed that the fabric itself seemed to resist her scissors, threads tangling into patterns she had not sewn. She quit, convinced that the cloth wants to perform as much as the actors. Local police began receiving complaints, yet when they attempted to investigate, Giuliano presented paperwork declaring his production approved by the city, daring them to challenge art itself. The officers left unsettled, unable to articulate why standing in the empty theater filled them with the sensation that someone unseen was breathing down their necks. The most chilling accounts came not from elite patrons but from ordinary citizens who claimed that after seeing the play, their lives began to unravel. One clerk reported that every night he saw the same shadow moving across his apartment wall, tracing the same gesture as one of the actors, though there was no light source. A widow wrote in her diary that she awoke to find herself sitting upright in bed, hands folded exactly as the characters did in the final act, her lips moving in whispers she did not understand. Children of those who attended began to speak lines from the play without being taught, parroting phrases that only their parents should have heard. It seemed as though the performance had leached beyond the walls of the theater, embedding itself in the lives of those who witnessed it, refusing to be forgotten. Newspapers could not resist the story. Some wrote scathing reviews, accusing Giuliano of staging a grotesque parody designed only to shock. Others, more sympathetic, praised his genius, claiming he had tapped into a primal truth about human fear. But buried among the columns were darker anecdotes, half ignored but impossible to dismiss, about fainting spells, sudden deaths, and audiences leaving not with applause, but with dread. The city council received petitions demanding the play be banned for public safety. Doctors argued about whether mass hysteria could explain so many varied symptoms. Priests began quietly conducting exorcisms for those who claimed to be haunted by lines. Rival artists denounced Giuliano, some out of envy, others out of genuine terror that he had awakened forces art was never meant to summon. In later folklore, this period became known as the season of the cursed stage. Older residents swore that for those 3 weeks in 1903, Turin itself felt heavier, as though time slowed whenever the theater's doors opened at dusk. The cobblestones leading to the venue seemed colder to the touch, and street lamps flickered whenever the actors began their lines. While official reports dismissed all of this as embellishment, the persistence of the story suggests that the play left an impression not just on its audience, but on the very atmosphere of the city. For years afterward, people claimed that simply walking past the abandoned theater at night caused them to hear faint applause, a ghostly reminder of a performance that had crossed the boundary between art and affliction. What distinguished La Notte Senza Fine from any other tragedy was not merely its unsettling content, but the sense that it consumed its witnesses. A typical play ends with curtain call and dispersal. This one seemed to follow people home, invading their dreams, seizing their thoughts, eroding the line between stage and life. The first victims were not merely spectators. They became participants in something they never consented to join. Their deaths, collapses, and nightmares were the earliest warnings that Giuliano's creation was not safe to behold. Though whether it was a trick of psychology, a curse invoked by rituals, or some strange collective possession remained unclear, what was certain was that the chaos demanded explanation, and soon doctors, priests, police, and rival artists would each attempt to impose their own narrative upon what had truly happened inside the theater. Their investigations, however, would only deepen the mystery, drawing Turin into a spiral from which it would not easily escape. In the weeks following the collapse of audiences and the strange afflictions that seemed to shadow those who attended La Notte Senza Fine, the city of Turin found itself divided between those who sought rational explanation and those who saw unmistakable signs of the supernatural. Doctors from Milan and Florence were summoned at the request of wealthy patrons desperate to know whether what their families had endured could be cured with medicine. These physicians, carrying reputations polished in universities and hospitals, arrived with the confidence of men who believed all mysteries could be unraveled by scalpels and reason. They interviewed survivors, observed actors, and examined the theater itself, concluding at first that the strange echoes and lingering voices were products of acoustics, combined with a suggestible crowd. One physician even suggested that Giuliano Marchetti, whether consciously or not, had stumbled upon a form of subliminal suggestion that predated modern hypnotism. By pacing dialogue and repeating lines in subtle rhythms, he might have entranced the audience into a trance-like state, heightening their vulnerability to hallucinations. Others argued that faulty lamps burning gas could have released low levels of toxins into the hall, producing dizziness, fainting, even visions. To these doctors, the play was nothing more than a case study in environmental psychology, its terrors explainable through chemistry and nerves. Yet their conclusions failed to quiet the rising fear, for every rational theory collided with testimonies that refused to be confined to science. Priests, by contrast, saw no ambiguity. To them, the accounts of voices whispering from nowhere, of reflections moving independently, of dreams repeating scenes word for word, bore the unmistakable mark of demonic interference. Local clergy began blessing the theater in small, secret ceremonies, sprinkling holy water along its aisles, whispering prayers at its stage. Yet these rituals themselves became fodder for rumor, for more than one priest claimed that the candles they lit extinguished themselves without breeze, plunging them into darkness, while one swore that as he raised the crucifix toward the balcony, the wood grew suddenly heavy in his hands as if pressed upon by unseen resistance. Most chilling of all were the reports from the church directly across the street. The old organ, untouched by any musician, groaned late at night in tones that matched the final chords of Marchetti's play, a droning lament that seeped through the cobbled streets like the echo of an unfinished performance. Parishioners began avoiding evening mass, terrified that simply entering the vicinity would draw them into the curse. Scientists, too, conducted their tests, hoping to reclaim the territory for reason. Acousticians from Florence mapped the interior of the theater, noting that its architecture created unusual sound pockets. A whisper uttered from the stage could indeed travel with clarity to the farthest balcony, while overlapping voices produced strange reverberations that seemed to come from invisible corners. They demonstrated this to skeptical journalists who gasped when whispers slid like silk across the air. Yet even these tests faltered when they failed to explain the consistency of visions reported by entire audiences. How could acoustics produce identical nightmares among dozens of unrelated spectators? How could hallucinations repeat the same imagery, the same sequences in people who had never met? A toxicologist suggested that mold spores within the damp wooden beams might have induced delirium, but samples collected yielded nothing extraordinary. The frustration grew palpable. Each rational theory held a kernel of plausibility yet collapsed under the weight of inexplicable detail. Critics, meanwhile, dismissed all notions of curses and demons. They argued that art, when provocative enough, could stir collective imagination to the point of frenzy. Just as ancient orators swayed crowds with rhetoric, so too had Marchetti mastered the craft of suggestive storytelling. To them, the fainting, the nightmares, the supposed apparitions were nothing but the echoes of impressionable minds, intoxicated by a scandalous performance. Yet even these confident skeptics found themselves faltering when confronted with the growing file of accounts that defied easy dismissal. A respected art critic, who had scoffed publicly at the idea of the play's supernatural influence, confided weeks later that after reading only fragments of the script borrowed from a friend, he had begun to dream of a stage bathed in endless shadow, the same dream repeating until he refused to touch the papers again. Another journalist sent to write a debunking piece reported waking with lines from the play, scrawled across his own notebook in his handwriting, though he had no memory of writing them. Slowly, even the voices of skepticism began to betray cracks, as though the play's reach extended beyond those who watched it performed into those who merely touched its words. This battle between science and superstition became a spectacle of its own, each camp desperate to claim the narrative. The doctors, proud of their diagnoses, declared hysteria. The priests, armed with scripture, cried possession. The scientists, guided by measurement, blamed acoustics and toxins, and the critics, confident in their pens, dismissed it all as theater. Yet in the center of this storm stood the survivors, men and women who insisted that no theory explained what they had endured. Their bodies shook when recounting the moments, their voices cracked when describing the echoes, their eyes welled with tears when recalling the shadows that moved across their walls at night. Rationalists dismissed them as traumatized, but their sincerity was undeniable, and their accounts sowed doubt even in hardened investigators. The most unsettling development came when outsiders who had never seen the performance but came to study it reported being affected. A physician from Milan, after spending several nights reviewing case notes and witness testimonies, confided in a colleague that he awoke each night to the sensation of someone whispering directly into his ear, though his room was locked. A priest who read a copied passage aloud during discussion with fellow clergy was seized by sudden silence, unable to speak for hours afterward, his throat constricted as though gripped by invisible hands. A scientist who handled one of the stage props left in storage reported hearing faint applause in his laboratory long after he returned home. These incidents blurred the boundary between observation and participation, convincing some that La Notte Senza Fine was not merely a play, but a contagion of experience, spreading beyond the stage into every realm that dared examine it. The debate spilled into newspapers, into cafes, into universities, into pulpits. Letters to editors demanded explanations. Was it poison in the lamps, or was it the devil himself? Was Giuliano Marchetti a genius ahead of his time, experimenting with hypnotic suggestion, or was he a sorcerer cloaking ritual in the guise of theater? No consensus emerged, only polarization, and the mystery deepened with every passing day. When a council was convened to determine whether the play should be banned outright, the meeting itself descended into chaos. A doctor presented evidence of hysteria, a priest thundered of demonic rites, a critic accused both of fear-mongering, and before long the room erupted into shouting. Witnesses in the corridor swore that amid the uproar, they heard a faint chorus of voices reciting lines from the play itself, though none inside admitted to speaking them. The council adjourned without resolution, and the theater remained open for only a handful of nights longer before authorities, unable to explain yet unwilling to risk further deaths, quietly ordered its closure. What remains chilling about this chapter of the story is the futility of both science and superstition. Doctors could not explain the dreams. Priests could not banish the echoes. Scientists could not quantify the apparitions. Critics could not silence the witnesses. Each explanation, no matter how confident, collapsed in the face of anomalies that refused to submit. It was as though the play itself thrived on contradiction, feeding upon the tug-of-war between rational and irrational, and growing stronger the more it was dissected. And so the argument remained unresolved, festering in Turin's consciousness, a scar that no analysis could heal. If the truth lay hidden somewhere between gases and demons, acoustics and curses, no one could unearth it. What lingered was unease, the sensation that something had slipped loose during those performances, something neither microscope nor crucifix could contain. And as these debates raged, the voices of survivors continued to echo louder, demanding to be heard, their testimonies carrying both rational explanations and chilling descriptions that defied all categories. Their accounts would not only complicate the argument, but deepen the mystery, drawing the city, and eventually the world, into a labyrinth of questions from which no exit could be found. They say a stage can hold 1,000 truths, but the accounts of those who survived La Notte Senza Fin suggest it held something else entirely, something that could not be contained within velvet curtains or carved balconies. It was not merely that they saw a disturbing play, nor that they walked away rattled by unsettling performances. Their stories were not the ramblings of spectators recalling a haunting work of art. No, their voices, written, whispered, confessed in trembling tones, spoke of transformations so intimate and violent that the line between memory and nightmare dissolved. If Giuliano Marchetti had set out to prove that theater could change reality, the survivors were his proof, unwilling though they were. Their testimonies became the backbone of the legend, giving shape to what official reports could not capture, that those who entered the theater did not simply watch a play, but lived through something no curtain call could erase. The first confessions came quietly, scrawled in private diaries or murmured in late-night conversations. One actress, known only as Caterina V., had played a minor role in the production. Her presence on stage was fleeting, her lines unremarkable. Yet years later, when interviewed by a folklorist gathering material on urban legends, she admitted that after one particular performance, she awoke with memories that were not her own. In a letter she refused to publish but which surfaced after her death, she described dreaming of 2 decades compressed into a single night. She recalled a life lived in some nameless village where she bore 3 children, buried 2, and grew old beside a faceless husband whose features slipped away like mist. I awoke with grief that was not mine, she wrote. And when I saw myself in the mirror, for an instant I expected to see gray hair. No doctor could offer an explanation, though one dismissed it as a particularly vivid nightmare caused by exhaustion. Yet to Caterina, the grief felt so authentic that she spent the remainder of her career avoiding roles involving family or loss, as though any brush with such emotions might reopen that phantom life she had already mourned. Other testimonies were less poetic, more visceral in their terror. A stagehand named Lorenzo claimed that during intermission, he descended beneath the stage to adjust ropes and counterweights. While crouched in the darkness, he heard someone calling his name. The voice was unmistakable. It was his own, echoing from beneath the floorboards. At first he laughed it off, convinced another worker was playing a cruel joke. But then, as he leaned closer, the boards vibrated, and the voice grew louder. Lorenzo, it said again in a pitch and cadence identical to his. He fled without finishing his work, shaking so violently he could not return to his post. He left the theater before the final act and never set foot in it again. For years. Afterward, he avoided basements, attics, or any enclosed space, insisting that if he lingered too long in silence, he would hear himself whispering back. Even critics, those most skeptical of superstition, were not immune. A well-known columnist, Emilio Fabri, had mocked the hysteria surrounding the production in his early reviews. He accused audiences of being starved aristocrats so desperate for sensation they imagine phantoms in candle smoke. Yet his final essay, never published in the paper but discovered in his study after his sudden disappearance, carried a different tone. Marchetti, he wrote, has torn a hole in the curtain between art and eternity. We are not spectators but participants in a ritual we cannot understand. The actors do not perform for us. They summon us into their dream. Fabri's body was never recovered, though his clothes were found neatly folded near the banks of the Po River. Some claimed suicide, others an accident. But among those who had seen the play, the whispers were darker, that he had walked willingly into another realm, answering a call he could no longer resist. Not all accounts came from prominent voices. Servants, ushers, and even ticket scalpers contributed to the growing lore. One usher, a boy no older than 16, reported that applause often continued even when the audience had fallen silent. "The clapping came from behind us," he said, "from the upper balconies that were empty. It was slow, deliberate, as though approving of something we could not see." Another spoke of mirrors backstage, where reflections lagged behind the actors' movements, eyes blinking seconds too late, mouths forming words already spoken. At first these seemed like embellishments, the kind of fantastical details that stories gather as they spread. Yet the consistency of such claims, often from people who did not know one another, gave them an unsettling weight. Doctors tried to reduce these confessions to the language of psychology. They spoke of hysteria, of shared delusions, of trauma manifesting in hallucination. They reminded the public that memory is fallible, that the human mind can weave experiences into something more dramatic than they truly were. But the survivors rejected such dismissals, insisting that their experiences were too real, too sharp, to be dismissed as tricks of the mind. For them, the play was not just seen but endured. Many carried physical symptoms long after: trembling hands, bouts of sleeplessness, sudden fits of weeping, or the uncanny sense of being observed when alone. Some accounts ventured into territory so strange that even believers hesitated to repeat them. One woman, a seamstress who had worked on costumes, swore that after handling the garments worn on stage, she found her own clothes subtly altered. Patterns she had never stitched appeared in the hems of her skirts, and once she claimed to see a fabric tear close itself before her eyes. A violinist in the pit confessed that midway through a performance, he realized he was playing notes he had never practiced. "The music was written into me," he wrote later, "as though my hands remembered a song I had never learned." Such stories blurred the line between testimony and hallucination, between confession and folklore. But their persistence gave the legend of La Notte Senza Fine a texture no official record could erase. Perhaps the most haunting testimonies came from those who tried to forget. Survivors who moved away from Turin, who swore never to attend the theater again, nevertheless carried the play with them. A merchant who had seen the performance confessed, on his deathbed, that for decades he had dreamed the same dream, standing in an endless hallway lined with doors, each door painted black, each handle cold to the touch. Behind one door, he said, voices whispered in unison, reciting lines from the play. He never opened the door, though he feared what might happen if he ever did. Another survivor, a widow, described how the laughter of children sounded different after the play, thinner, hollow, as though echoing from a place far away. "Once you hear voices that are not meant for this world," she said, "you never mistake them again." The clergy, too, collected testimonies, often treating them as evidence of possession or spiritual corruption. Priests urged survivors to confess, to cleanse themselves through ritual, to resist what they called the echo of the endless night. Some survivors complied, yet even after exorcisms and blessings, they reported lingering shadows at the edges of their vision or sudden bursts of cold that left their breath visible in warm rooms. The church could offer absolution, but it could not silence the memories. For many, survival meant retreat. Some survivors lived as recluses, withdrawing from society to avoid theaters, concerts, or any gathering where performance blurred with ritual. A few turned to writing, trying to purge their experiences onto paper. These writings, scattered in private collections and dusty archives, are now considered the most valuable fragments of the legend. They are inconsistent, contradictory, and often fragmented, yet together they form a mosaic of horror that resists rational explanation. The endurance of these testimonies lies not in their veracity, but in their emotional truth. Whether hallucinations, trauma, or encounters with something genuinely supernatural, the survivors believed what they experienced. Their words carry the weight of conviction, trembling with the urgency of those who fear they will not be believed. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of La Notte Senza Fine, that it left its victims unable to fully trust their own minds, forever questioning whether the horrors they endured were born within or imposed from beyond. It is from these accounts, poetic, terrifying, contradictory, that the legend gained its power. Official reports could be filed away, scientific theories debated and forgotten, but human stories linger. They pass from mouth to mouth, gathering new shadings with each telling, ensuring that the memory of the play never dies. And so the testimonies of Caterina, Lorenzo, Fabri, and countless others became not just fragments of history, but the heart of the mystery itself. Their words are the closest we will ever come to seeing the play again, though perhaps that is a mercy. For if even fragments of memory could unhinge those who lived through it, one can only imagine the cost of experiencing the performance in full. The survivors' voices converge into a chilling chorus. The play was not theater. It was ritual, a summoning, a passageway, and those who passed through it, even briefly, were marked forever. Some tried to explain, others tried to forget, but none could escape. Their testimonies ensured that La Notte Senza Fine would never vanish into obscurity. It would live on, whispered in candlelight, remembered not as entertainment but as a forbidden threshold no audience should have crossed. Transition. Such testimonies fueled competing theories, each claiming to explain the unexplainable. The aftermath of La Notte Senza Fine left Turin with more questions than answers, and over the decades theories multiplied like shadows cast against candlelight. Survivors whispered one version, doctors argued another, while priests thundered their condemnations from pulpits. Artists, historians, skeptics, and occultists all claimed their interpretation was the truth. Yet no single explanation could hold the weight of what had happened inside that doomed theater. What emerged instead was a labyrinth of competing narratives, each reflecting not only the mystery of the play, but also the anxieties of the age. To this day, none can be dismissed and none can be fully embraced. Each theory is a mirror that shows part of the image, but never the whole. The rationalists were the first to speak, eager to strip the play of any suggestion of the supernatural. They argued that Giuliano Marchetti was, if nothing else, a man ahead of his time. His methods, they claimed, anticipated psychological manipulation decades before such ideas would be formally studied. Some critics compared his techniques to what would later be known as propaganda, the subtle use of language and imagery to bypass conscious thought and penetrate the deeper recesses of the mind. Marchetti, they insisted, had crafted a play that functioned not as narrative entertainment but as suggestion, embedding ideas in rhythms and cadences that the brain could not resist. To audiences unprepared for such manipulation, the result would feel like hypnosis, hallucination, or even possession. Yet the rationalist theory raises more questions than it answers. How could a playwright with no formal training in psychology have stumbled upon techniques so precise and effective that they left hardened critics trembling and ordinary spectators unable to sleep? Even propaganda relies on repetition, saturation, and the power of institutions. Marchetti's play, staged only a handful of times, should not have been capable of producing effects so devastating that people swore their lives were rewritten in dreams. Still, the rationalists persisted, suggesting that the hysteria was amplified by social contagion, the tendency of crowds to mirror one another's emotions. Once one person fainted, others followed. Once one whispered of nightmares, the rumor spread like infection, embedding itself in the fragile minds of the curious and the fearful alike. Others turned to science of a more material kind. A favorite explanation among engineers and physicians of the era was gas poisoning. The theater, after all, relied on lamps that burned imperfectly, releasing carbon monoxide into the enclosed space. Audiences who inhaled too much might indeed suffer dizziness, hallucinations, fainting, and even death. It was a tidy explanation, one that allowed authorities to blame poor infrastructure rather than dangerous art. Yet this theory too collapses under scrutiny. Why, if gas poisoning were the cause, did symptoms manifest so selectively? Why did actors backstage, closest to the lamps, suffer fewer collapses than those seated in the grand balconies? And why did the nightmares persist for weeks, months, even years afterward, long after the air was clear? Science could explain confusion in the moment, but it could not account for the haunting residue that clung to survivors like a shadow they could not shake. If rationalists and scientists offered tidy solutions, the occultists gave voice to darker possibilities. Among them, the theory that Marchetti's play was not art at all, but ritual. According to these interpreters, La Notte Senza Fine was a deliberate attempt to merge theater with forbidden ceremonies whispered of in ancient texts. Marchetti's known interest in Greek mystery rites and his rumored attendance at spiritualist salons fed this interpretation. The structure of the play, some claimed, mirrored the stages of initiation found in the Eleusinian mysteries: procession, revelation, and descent into darkness. But unlike the ancient rites which promised renewal, Marchetti's work seemed to offer only terror and despair. The suggestion, then, was clear. The playwright had attempted to summon or bind forces beyond the human sphere, weaving his audience into the fabric of the invocation. If victims fainted, it was not hysteria but sacrifice. If nightmares lingered, it was because they had glimpsed, however briefly, the world beyond the veil. The most sensational variation of this occult theory insisted that the theater itself played a role. It was whispered that the building had been erected atop ancient Roman catacombs, where the bones of forgotten soldiers and slaves lay undisturbed. The restless dead, it was said, lent their voices to the performance. When actors spoke their lines, echoes rose not from the walls but from beneath the earth, carrying the resonance of countless buried throats. Though historians dispute whether such catacombs even existed in that part of Turin, the legend endures. After all, those who reported hearing applause from empty balconies or voices whispering in silence could find in this story a chilling explanation. It was not imagination, but the audience of the dead. Skeptics countered with their own modern lens, pointing not to spirits but to belief itself. They suggested that the phenomenon of la notte senza fine was less about what happened on stage and more about what people expected to happen. Rumors had preceded the play, feeding anticipation of something dangerous, something uncanny.
Once the first fainting spell struck, expectation became destiny.
Modern psychologists call this the placebo effect, or in darker forms, the nocebo effect, the power of belief to produce illness, visions, or even death.
In this reading, Marchetti's true genius was not in crafting supernatural forces, but in manipulating the most human of all weaknesses, the hunger to believe in what frightens us most.
And yet, even this theory falters. If belief alone shaped the experience, why did investigators, skeptical men of science armed with reason, also report strange dreams after reading mere fragments of the script? Why did symptoms persist in those who tried desperately not to believe, who begged doctors and priests alike to cure them of hallucinations that continued despite their disbelief? The placebo theory explains much, but not all. Like every other attempt to solve the riddle, it leaves too much unaccounted for. Other myths spiraled outward over the years, more imaginative than plausible, but no less compelling. Some whispered that the script itself was cursed, written not by Marchetti but dictated to him by something unseen. The vanishing of the original manuscript only strengthened such tales. A few claimed that anyone who read the complete text would fall into madness, which explained why it had been hidden away, or destroyed, by those who feared its influence. Another myth suggested that Marchetti himself had not vanished, but had been consumed by his own creation, pulled into the endless night he had conjured. In this telling, the playwright was both artist and victim, his ambition punished by the very forces he sought to command. The persistence of these theories reveals as much about human nature as it does about the play. Each generation reshaped La Notte Senza Fine according to its fears. For the early 20th century, it was hysteria, carbon monoxide, and the fragility of the modern city. For mid-century occultists, it was ritual, sacrifice, and forbidden knowledge. For late-century psychologists, it became a study in mass suggestion, a cautionary tale about the malleability of the human mind. And for storytellers, folklorists, and lovers of the macabre, it was, and remains, a ghost story too good to relinquish. What all theories share, however, is their failure. Not one provides a complete account. Rationalism collapses under the weight of testimony too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence. Science explains the fainting spells, but not the decades of lingering nightmares. Superstition offers haunting images, but no clarity on why some were affected while others escaped untouched. Even the placebo effect cannot explain why hardened skeptics determined to resist fell prey to the same terrors. The truth seems to slip between categories, mocking every attempt to pin it down. And so the mystery of La Notte Senza Fine endures, not despite the contradictions, but because of them. Every failed explanation deepens the allure. Every unsolved fragment makes the legend more irresistible. Perhaps that is the final triumph of Marchetti. Whether by design or accident, he created a story that refuses resolution, a puzzle that remains unsolved more than a century later. Theories and myths swirl endlessly, but like the play's title itself, they promise no dawn, no conclusion, only an endless night of speculation, transition, This leads to the haunting present day where the play's mystery still hangs unresolved. Today, no verified copy of La Nota Senza Fine survives, though whispers insist fragments still exist in hidden hands. Some argue Giuliano Marchetti, tormented by what he had unleashed, burned the manuscript himself in a final act of self-destruction. Others insist that it was seized by church authorities, locked away in forbidden archives alongside grimoires too dangerous for public eyes. Yet another version claims that a single copy was spirited into private possession, passed quietly through generations of wealthy collectors who dared never stage it, but who read it in secret, and suffered dreams so vivid that they took their own lives rather than endure another night within them. Whatever the truth, no one can produce the script, and in its absence the mystery deepens, for absence itself has become part of its legend. The theater where it first played out remains a husk of memory, its velvet seats reduced to dust, its stage warped and cracked with neglect. Birds nest in the rafters, ivy coils along the balconies, and yet travelers swear that if they linger long enough past midnight, they hear faint applause echoing through the hollow chamber. Others claim the warped stage boards still give off a faint hum, as if remembering lines once spoken upon them. A handful of daring investigators have even brought recording equipment, and though most report silence, a few insist that playback reveals faint murmurs beneath the static, phrases in Italian no one recalls uttering. Was it coincidence, faulty machinery, or the voice of a play that refuses to die? No one can say for certain. The rational mind insists that all of this must be explainable. Suggestibility, hysteria, carbon monoxide poisoning, shared rumor. It is tempting to settle on these, to close the book with relief and say, here lies nothing but coincidence dressed in superstition. And yet doubt gnaws at the edges of certainty. Too many witnesses insisted on details that aligned too perfectly across accounts. Too many lives were altered irrevocably by a single night's performance. Can rumor alone conjure visions that linger across generations? Can hysteria explain echoes where no sound exists? The explanations reassure, but they never silence the unease. And so the legend of La Notte Senza Fine endures, straddling the line between fact and nightmare. Perhaps it was no more than a scandal lost to history, a work of theater exaggerated into myth by frightened minds. Or perhaps it was something far more dangerous, the closest humankind has ever come to turning art into a doorway, a performance that ceased to be entertainment and became invocation. If so, Marchetti may have achieved a power beyond comprehension and paid for it with his disappearance. The final question lingers, as all chilling stories must. If the manuscript were found tomorrow, restored intact, would you dare to read it aloud? Or would you, like the villagers who barred the theater doors, choose silence over revelation? Some doors, after all, were never meant to be opened.